Hi guys, hope you're doing well. Let's get the show on the road. Ever since Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire in 1521, the story of that conquest has been told and retold and told again, generation after generation. Written about in hundreds of books, aired out in tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of lectures over the last nearly 500 years. From the grade school level all the way up to the university, there have been, up until the 1960s, a certain set of advantages possessed by the Spanish that were always presumed to be incontrovertible as a natural law. But when these so-called advantages are really held up to close scrutiny, it becomes clear that most of them were either non-existent or not all that important, and that, in fact, there were just a few advantages possessed by the Spanish that ultimately mattered when it came time to determine the fate of the Aztec Empire. In this lecture, I'm going to talk first about the non-advantages, or the ones that have been unthinkingly included as part of the historical record up until the mid to late 20th century, but that are easily proven to be nonsense. Then those factors which were of some advantage to the Spanish conquistadors. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the three essential advantages without which the history of the world might have become a very, very different thing. So to begin with, let's talk about the non-advantages. There's two of them: strong and fearless leadership and divine will. Okay, so the first one is easily done away with. When you go back and you read any kind of history written of the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs in the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, 1800s, I mean, just about forever, all the way up until, again, the 1960s or so, the story always goes like this. A brave and courageous ragtag band of Spanish adventurers were able to topple a mighty empire of 25 million. How were they able to do this? Because of the strong and courageous leadership, the fearless leadership of Hernan Cortez and his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado and a couple of other guys. And basically the idea is that there were these 4, 5, 6 guys that were so brave, so absolutely without fear, and such tremendous natural leaders that they were able to, against overwhelming odds, to beat the Aztecs just because of the brilliance and the fortitude of their leadership. Now, look at these Spanish soldiers here. They look like tough guys. They've got the right look on their faces and, etc., and weapons, armor, and whatever. But really, guys, come on. If you take any big army from one part of the world at a given time in history and present it against another big army from some part of the world at that same kind of given time in history, and each army has got, more or less the same number of guys, there's going to be great leaders on each side. The Aztec, they had great war leaders, tremendously brave, fierce, brilliant tacticians and strategists. The Spanish had no advantage here of any kind whatsoever. Okay, Cortez had never been to military, academy. Pedro de Alvarado had never read, Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War. Forget it. There was no advantage for the Spanish in terms of leadership. Okay, none, zero. It was a dead even heat between the Aztecs and the Spanish on that count. Now, the next thing, divine intervention. All those histories that I mentioned earlier, they always talk about how God was on the side of the Spanish. God wanted the Aztecs conquered so that they could be converted to Catholicism and brought to the Lord Jesus Christ, have their souls saved and all that good stuff. Okay, I don't want to offend anybody's delicate religious sensibilities out here, but this can't be proven in any way whatsoever. And since this is a history class and not a, relative theologies and world history class or something where we study sacred truths of creation and give them all the same kind of, screen time, forget it, guys. God was not on their side. Okay, the Aztecs, God was certainly not on their side. Huitzilopochtli and Tonantzin and Coatlicue and Quetzalcoatl, that they were not on the side of the Spanish. God, the God of the Christians, the God of the Catholic Church, if such a being exists, was not on the side of the Spanish. Okay, But what you have to remember is that the Spanish had a very particular identity at this point in time relative to their religion of the Catholic Church. Remember that up until just 30 years ago, for 800 years, the area of the world that we now know of as Spain and Portugal, a piece of Europe called the Iberian Peninsula, that part of the world had been conquered by North African Muslims, okay, who were more often called Moors, M-O-O-R-S, by the Spaniards and the Portuguese. The Moors had invaded out of North Africa way back in the 8th century. And for 800 years after that, they owned the Spaniards and the Portuguese. They controlled the Iberian Peninsula. It was 800 years of nonstop conflict as the Spanish and the Portuguese tried to regain control of their territories, their kingdoms are a part of the world, okay? Their resistance against the Moors for 800 years was forged in a crucible of Catholicism, okay? And out of that Catholic crusade, the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, came a very particular Catholic saint, Saint James Matamoros, or Saint James the Moor Killer, Saint James the Muslim Killer, okay? This was the guy that all those tough, strong Catholic warriors prayed to, called out to, invoked in their times of need, okay? When they were going to go into battle against the Moors. St. James, bless me, St. James Matamoros, okay? But then when they came to the Americas, they tweaked his name a little bit because there weren't any Moors, there were no Muslims to fight or conquer in the Americas, but there were Indians. And so in the Americas, he became St. James Mata Indios, or St. James the Indian Killer. You see this tremendous image here, this painting by the great Mexican muralist Jorge González Camarena, where he's sort of syncretizing the image of a Mexican revolutionary along with St. George the Dragon Killer, and then titling it as St. James Mata Indios for purposes of his own, which I don't really understand, to be honest. All the research I've done, I can't really find out what Camarena had exactly in mind in terms of the title. But anyway, St. James Mata Indios, okay? Now, that's all very interesting. But nonetheless, there was no divine power of any kind on the side of the Spanish in their struggle with the Aztecs, okay? Those two advantages were nonsense. They were non-advantages. They did not exist. Except maybe in the case of this last one, in the sense that if you believe in it strongly enough, maybe it gives you some kind of an advantage. But that's so insubstantial and hard to pin down or identify or prove in any way. Forget about it. Okay. Now, let's take into account those factors. Oops, I forgot about this. This is, sorry, my image of the Almighty. Okay. Yeah, you get the idea, right? But not on the side of the Spanish, all right? Okay, now, the factors that were of some advantage, there were three that did give some kind of edge, some kind of advantage to the Spanish. It's hard to determine in some areas, but certainly no question that it helped. The power of prophecy, writing, and a broader degree of literacy, the ability to read and write among the Spanish, as opposed to the Aztecs, and horses and dogs, okay? Excuse me while I move my notes here. So, first of all, let's talk about this power of prophecy thing. You may recall from an earlier lecture that there was an ancient king of the Toltecs, Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, who was sent into exile in the East. This is way before the Aztec Empire was even created. But the bottom line is that he had made a prophecy that he would return in the year 1 reed to reclaim his throne or to strike at the king, and it just so happens that in the year 1 reed, from the lands of the east across the ocean where Topiltzin had supposedly gone into exile too, here comes these ships with all these strange, peculiar dudes with hair on their faces, wearing, well, you know, the carapaces of insects, this magical kind of armor. They have these unbelievable weapons with edges that are simply not to be like conceived of by the Aztecs. They had firearms and cannons. Think of this, guys. The loudest thing in the world to the Aztecs. What's the loudest thing? A great big rock falling off, you know, when they're constructing something and hitting the ground, or the mingled voices of thousands in the Zocalo as they raised up their voices to, you know, praise the gods or something. Thunder. They'd never heard anything like the immediate concussive sound of a firearm or a cannon, right? When the Spaniards arrived at exactly that moment, that year, when the god was supposed to come back, and Topiltzin supposedly had fair skin and a beard, okay, and here's Cortez, and he shows up, and the Indians say, hey, are you the god who's returned to take back the throne of the Aztec Empire with all the gold and everything? You know, Cortez goes, yeah, yeah, that's me. Bow down, everyone, right? He immediately seized this opportunity with both hands and his teeth and hung on to it. There's no question that there was some question in the minds of those Indians as to whether or not the Spaniards were divine beings or not, whether or not Cortez was the returned god king Topiltzin. They weren't sure entirely, okay? But even that ambiguity, what if it is the god come back, right? I mean, what if he has returned it? You don't want to be on his wrong side. You don't want to do the wrong thing, right? They needed to be sure. And in their inability to prove anything, they sort of erred on the side of, if he is a god, let's make sure he doesn't get angry at us, right? It also didn't hurt that in the year prior to the arrival of Cortez and the Spaniards on the coast, there was a volcanic eruption near Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. There was a meteor shower. Okay, anything that happened up in the heavens, guys, whether it was a shooting star or a meteor shower or an eclipse or even volcanic eruptions, these were all seen as signs from the gods, some kind of indication from a god or the gods that something was going to happen. Good, bad, you know, hard to say. They were omens. They had to be interpreted by the priests, right? Well, you know, you see all these omens. You're the emperor, Moctezuma, who was a very spiritual and mystical kind of guy anyway. In other words, he was just the kind of emperor who would believe that the god has returned. And okay, so you've seen all this stuff, you're thinking about it, you've consulted with the priests a lot, you know, and then here comes a messenger from the coast bearing the news that these magical beings have arrived, and it appears that it's Topiltzin, and this definitely provided the Spaniards with some kind of an advantage. I mean, remember, they made their way all the way to Mexico City. They were invited in to stay in the palace, you know, like down the hall from the emperor, even though they had all these weapons and these abilities and these magical powers. I mean, again, you know, Moctezuma was erring on the side of not wanting to anger the gods, because if they are the gods, you know, well then, yeah, you know, how else could they have gotten in there, right? I mean, imagine inviting just guys from some other part of the world with great powers and abilities right into your house. I mean, what if they want to kill you? What if they want to take over? But again, there was ambiguity. The Aztecs didn't quite know what was going on with them. They started to suspect after a while, but they didn't know. And so that the power of that prophecy, the belief that the Spaniards might have been divine beings, it did provide them with some degree of an advantage. Some, no question. Look at this tile mosaic here. You see a conquistador on a winged horse superimposed over the sun, plunging straight down out of the sky onto these two Aztec warriors. Yes, they have a spear up, but you can see the one guy's got his hand over his face and the other one is sort of bending over almost backwards. It's like they're being conquered by the sun, the gods, this celestial power. They're on the ruins of their empire, right? These kind of building blocks suggestive of the ruin, the destruction of all the greatness of the Aztecs. Yeah, here's an image sort of suggesting that the power of that prophecy. Okay, now, what about writing and the broader degree of literacy amongst the Spanish? This is also, it's important, okay? At a certain point, Cortez needed to send a message from Tenochtitlan about 300 miles back to the coast where a lot of his guys are. He wanted to come as reinforcements. He wanted a larger army, right? Well, how did he do that? He wrote a note, you know, a lengthy letter, right? And then folded it all up and sent it by horseback with one of his guys, or more than one, I'm not sure. But okay, you know, horses, if you're not whipping them to death, a horse on a road can make a good 30 miles a day, bringing a piece of information that leaves no room for ambiguity because it's written down, every single word that Cortez wanted them to know. It's right there. The ability of not just Cortez, but a bunch of the other guys amongst the Spanish, not to mention the priests that they had with them, their ability to read and write was definitely an advantage because the Aztecs had a kind of writing, okay, it's called pictoglyphic writing, writing by way of pictures, okay. You know, the Spanish could write a grocery list like, hey, you know, when you're on your way, stop by the store and get some of those frozen burritos, you know, and a couple of bottles of tequila and whatever. The most mundane and trivial things and the loftiest, largest things, praise to the king or to God, could be written with the 26 characters of the Cyrillic alphabet, okay? But what the Aztecs had was a highly specialized form of writing, and very, very few people could write it or read it. And it took a really, really long time to say anything in this pictoglyphic writing, okay? So what the Aztecs had going for them in terms of literacy was no advantage at all in terms of the conquest. What the Spaniards had going for them was definitely of some advantage, okay? Not tremendous, but no question about it, it had something to do with it, okay? Now, last but not least, in terms of the advantages that were of some importance, are horses and dogs. Right now, what's the big deal with horses? Well, I already made reference to part of it. You know, the Aztecs had runners that could run a good, you know, 10 or 12 miles in a day or something like that, okay? And then hand off a message to another runner who could then run about the same distance, and then there would be another little place where there were runners stationed, and they could move messages fairly quickly. But come on, guys, the fastest guy in the world all day long ain't going to go anywhere that a horse is going to go. A horse can not only go much faster, it can carry 2 people or a lot of stuff on top of it, as well as a man in armor even perhaps. But the horses were not so important in terms of their speed and their ability to deliver messages. That was only kind of one time. There was this one, you know, moment in the conquest where Cortez needed that speed. They were more important in terms of their power as far as cavalry charges, pardon me. You know, I looked literally through thousands of images on the internet trying to come up with a cavalry charge, a painting, a drawing, a lithograph, a photograph from a modern film, something that would show Spaniards from back in the 17th, 16th centuries or something, you know, with swords and armor on horseback charging. I found nothing, okay? So here's a cavalry charge. You've seen movies. You've seen Troy or Gladiator or the Lord of the Rings movies or any number of things, westerns on television or movies about World War I, or there's all kinds of places where I know that you have seen what a cavalry charge looks like, okay? But you've really got to stop and think about what a cavalry charge does, especially to warriors on the opposing side who just don't have a clue as to what this is all about, okay? So let's take a step back for a minute. First of all, what's the biggest animal in Mesoamerica, the biggest creature aside from man in the Aztec world? It's a jaguar, right? Which is like a miniature tiger. Nowhere near as big and strong and heavy and badass as a lion or a tiger, but still, if you get it on the wrong side of a jaguar in a jungle, it'll kill you. No problem about it. It's a pretty big cat, okay? But, you know, it's about the size of a German Shepherd dog. You know, you could pick one up around the chest or carry it in your arms. You know, a horse weighs 1,200 pounds, 1,000 pounds, 1,500 pounds, between 1,000 and 1,500 pounds, depending upon how big the horse is. Okay, now imagine a horse running at top speed, 20 to 30 miles an hour, because we're talking about cavalry charges. They're short. They're not going to be running for 20 hours, or we're talking for like a minute or two. Okay, imagine dozens of horses, some of them with armor, with guys on back in armor, okay, with swords. Now imagine dozens of those horses all massed together, charging down upon guys that are standing on the ground, trying to resist them with swords. Guys, unless you have fought against cavalry charges in the past, you have not prepared the kind of spears and halberds and things that will allow you to deal to some degree with a cavalry charge. Even with that, a cavalry charge is devastating. The same way that a bowling ball rolling down the alley knocks the 10 pins in every direction, that's what a cavalry charge does to guys standing on the ground. The other advantage is that when you've got a master horseman on the back of a horse with one hand on the reins, wheeling the horse about and controlling its movements in the midst of a bunch of guys who are on the ground, and you got a razor-sharp steel sword, and you're chopping at their exposed necks, shoulders, arms, chests, and backs. Okay, you're going to do a lot of damn damage. Okay, now, could all those guys jump up and pull a dude out of a horse? Yeah, that could be done. But these guys were bound into their horses pretty securely, and they were very, very good at dealing with that. They knew how to deal with that. They'd been trained to fight from horseback. Okay, so those horses were of some advantage, no question about it, you know. And what I was talking about was size earlier. I digressed, I'm sorry, but, you know, just the impressiveness of the horses in terms of their size. Just the, I mean, what's the biggest creatures that you and I are around on a regular basis? You know, big dogs, I guess. Some of you maybe see horses here or there, or your family's got a horse somewhere, I don't know. But now imagine that we're out, you know, hanging around like where there's a herd of elephants, right? Elephants are something else. Ain't no horses, man, right there. Really something else. Well, that's how these horses were to the Aztecs. Now, what about dogs? The Spanish had brought to the Caribbean 30 years back. I mean, when they first began to colonize the islands of the Caribbean, they brought Mastiffs with them. Bull Mastiffs. These are big dogs, big, powerful dogs with very powerful jaws, a lot like a bulldog. Okay, now you look at this dog, you can see that he's like a powerful looking dog, but you can't really get the sense of his size because there's nothing next to him for contrast, right? So, Mastiffs, okay, they're big dogs. These two Mastiffs here are exceptionally large Mastiffs, okay, freakishly large, but, you know, normal ones are like 80% this big, okay? These Mastiffs had been trained and had it bred into them since they were puppies, okay? If we're talking about generations of dogs in the islands with the Spanish, they had been trained to eat the flesh of Indians. They had been trained to hunt Indians, runaway Indians, Indians that the Spanish were at war with. They would release these dogs on those Indians, and the dogs would attack and tear and rend and rip and kill. They were fed the infants, Indian babies, little kids. I'm not trying to gross you out. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what these dogs had been turned into, okay? They were murdering machines, all right? And they, because it was so hot, because it were in Mesoamerica, they constantly foamed at the mouth. There was just foam dripping from their mouth, and they're walking back and forth and looking at Indians, you know. And you can imagine how they again, what the Indians looking at these things are bigger than jaguars, okay? And as far as dogs go, I mean, for God's sakes, the Aztecs had Chihuahuas, okay? Chihuahua, Mastiff, Mastiff, Chihuahua, okay? I mean, a Chihuahua can be tough, sure. You know what I'm talking about, right? I mean, you've seen a Chihuahua get all aggro, right? Yeah, and if you stuck your pinky out, it could probably bite your pinky off if it got a really good shot and hung in there and you couldn't pull it out of its mouth. And look, I don't want a Chihuahua going after me. It could hurt me, right? Okay? no contest here. The dogs, Spanish dogs, the Mastiffs, helped them, gave them an advantage. Some advantage, okay? If they'd had 1,000 of them, it would have been a much bigger advantage. We don't know exactly how many they had. A couple of dozen, okay? They helped. Some. Not overwhelmingly, but definitely some. Okay, now we come to the big three. The great advantages. The advantages without which the Spanish might not have won and the Aztec Empire might have stood. For how much longer, who knows? Okay, so steel weapons and armor. I've been talking about that a little bit already, you know, in connection with other stuff, but we'll talk about it still here a little bit. Native disunity in allies and crowd diseases. Okay, so steel weapons and armor. Well, let's first of all talk about what the Aztecs had. Some of them had quilted armor, like basically like cotton, okay, like almost like a down vest or a down jacket without that nylon covering on it, thin leather covering over quilted cotton. That's not too bad when you're living in a world of wooden clubs and spears and wooden swords with stone edges, okay? Well, yes and no, because those wooden swords, those wooden swords with stone edges, which were called macuahuitl, okay? They were deadly, all right? Here you see one. This is a person who did a drawing where the macuahuitl is a little out of proportion. It's sort of too big and too heavy. It's a little too long, a little too thick, but it gives you the idea of it. A wooden sword, highly decorated and ornamentalized, okay? And then with chips of obsidian, volcanic glass, fastened into the edges, okay? Now, I don't know how much you guys know about obsidian. It's actually the sharpest thing on the earth that's totally natural. You don't have to make it in a laboratory or a factory like something out of steel. As far as naturally occurring substances, there's nothing that can be sharpened to a better edge than volcanic glass. In fact, believe it or not, some eye surgeries are performed, believe it or not with lasers, okay, but with obsidian instruments. Some highly specialized surgeries, okay? This is hardcore stuff. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of the conquistadors that was with Cortez, said that he saw during the conquest, during the siege of Tenochtitlan, an Aztec warrior wind up like with a baseball bat and let go with one of these swords, cut the head off a horse. Okay, now, that's pretty awesome. But, of course, obsidian is also going to chip. It is stone, and it's been sharpened to a very thin edge. So, you know, these swords were not meant to be used for in days and days and days, or let alone weeks and months of fighting, okay, which is what happened with the siege of Tenochtitlan. It went on for months, all right? They were not designed for that. Aztec battles did not last that long, or Mesoamerican battles, let's say, okay? So, these were awesome swords, okay? As an image from the film Apocalypto. You know, they could do some serious damage, but they were nothing compared to the steel swords and dirks and poniards and daggers of the Spanish and the steel armor that they had. Remember the guy on the horse with the steel armor and the helmet and the steel sword? Now imagine, you know, Joe Aztec on the ground. Okay, he's got this quilted armor. That does not stand up to a steel sword, guys. Okay, it just doesn't. Maybe 3 hours into the battle, the steel has become kind of dull, and it helps to a degree. But the great thing about those steel swords is they can be resharpened that night and used the next day, right back to razor edge, man. Okay? There's no contest here. The steel weapons and steel armor of the Spanish was an enormous advantage. It was also essentially advantageous when it came to binding native or Indian allies over to the Spanish, right? Because Spaniards had a lot of weapons with them, and if they wanted to really impress some chief or some king of some other Indian tribe or nation, okay, they could give away a sword, say, here, this helps to seal the bargain, you know, and then the wow, hey man, right? The cacique or the the chief, the king, whoever it was, depending on the size of the ally, the size of the society. Wow, right on, right? I mean, these steel weapons and armor were important in abstract ways or as symbols, okay? But now here we have an image from a mural that I've talked to you about before by the great Desiderio Hernandez Xochitl. And this pays tribute to the moment where the king of the Tlaxcalans met up with Cortez and his Spaniards, where they came together in friendship. They created an alliance. This is what really sealed the fate of the Aztecs. The Aztec Empire was enormous, but when it expanded over the course of 100 years, at certain points they ran into this Indian people or that Indian people, like the Tlaxcalans and like the Tarascans. And the Aztecs went, okay, if we're going to keep expanding in that direction, we got to beat the Tlaxcalans. And then as they talked it over, they said, well, look, we're this tough. Let's just make it like a size. We're this tough. The Tlaxcalans are that tough. They're almost as tough as we are. Could we beat them? Yeah. But we would lose so many men and so much power in beating them. It's a bad idea. So let's just create not an alliance with them, but let's just tell them, look, you can keep your kingdom at its current boundaries. We're going to expand to either side of you and beyond, okay? But you can become a tributary state within the Aztec Empire, and we'll just leave you alone, okay? Just every year you got to provide this tribute, that tribute. Well, the Tlaxcalans said, right on, as some other Indian people said. The Tlaxcalans were mighty. And they were sick of the Aztecs, okay? And they wanted to get rid of them. And so they were more than happy to ally themselves to these gods, maybe gods, certainly very tough guys with interesting weapons and magical powers. And yeah, native allies, guys. Native allies and the lack of unity amongst all the Indians. The fact that there were plenty of Indian peoples that wanted to get rid of the Aztecs, get rid of the guys at the top, right? That was an enormous advantage for Cortez and the Spanish. Here's a painting from the late 17th century, The Conquest of Mexico by Cortez. Okay, here you have Cortez right down here, right in the foreground, the lower right-hand corner, rearing back on the horse. Now, you see all the causeways, the kind of bridges that crossed the lake and came in to Tenochtitlan, and you can see down every one of those bridges in the distance the armies that are coming. These are all Indian allies. Cortez had somewhere approximately 200,000 Indian warriors fighting with him. How many Spaniards were there? Just a couple of hundred left at this point. He only started out with 600. Okay, so clearly 600 Spaniards were not going to beat the Aztec Empire of 25 million people. Okay, it was all those Indian allies that were so fed up to hear, that were sick to death of the Aztecs, so wanted to get rid of them. Little did they know the Spanish were going to take over and become even worse than the Aztecs, but all they could see was get rid of the guys at the top, and then we'll be in charge again. We'll be in charge of our own destiny. We won't have to pay tribute to the Aztecs. And yeah, tremendous advantage, those Indian allies. Okay, but last, and certainly not least, crowd diseases. Okay, there's different kind of diseases. Leprosy is a disease. Lou Gehrig's disease is a disease. Multiple sclerosis is a disease. But these are not things that you give to people. Well, you can give leprosy to someone, but it's really hard. They're not illnesses or diseases that can become epidemics or pandemics, spreading from one person to another quickly and wiping out whole societies. They're not like measles, plague, rubella, typhus, or smallpox. The Spaniards, coming from the old world, Europe, Asia, Africa, had built-in immunities. They were born with them to all of those crowd diseases and others that I'm not going to rattle the names off of. So they carried germs in their bodies that were not enough, were not powerful enough, were not numerous enough to make them sick, because they had antibodies to them within their immune systems, right? But Native American peoples had no resistance to these microbes, these bacteria, these diseases on any level whatsoever. They were like newborn infants, okay? So a Spaniard, just in the simple act of kissing an Indian woman, you know, or exchanging fluids in some other way, blood, whatever it might be, having intercourse, sexual intercourse, the Aztecs picked up smallpox. And right about the time that the Spaniards and all of their Indian allies were attacking in what was to become the last great battle, right, and the fall of the Aztec Empire, the siege of Tenochtitlan, right about that time, a tremendous smallpox epidemic was raging through Tenochtitlan. Something like 4 out of every 5 people were so sick that they couldn't even get up, okay, to do anything. Now think about that, 4 out of every 5 people. 4 out of every 5 people. You're talking about 80 out of every 100 people ill, okay? Only 20 people out of every 100 to take care of 80 people, right? Think about how problematic this is. Now, some of these people are going to survive. They're going to live. It's going to take them a while to convalesce and get back up to kind of full strength, but they will survive. But most of them won't. Most of them will die, okay? So right as this, at their most dramatic moment, at the moment of their greatest need, from their point of view, their gods deserted them. These other gods, or God, or something fell upon them, right? In the presence of the Spaniards and all of their Indian allies, and they were wiped out. Okay, they were wiped out. That without that disease, I mean, without the disease, could the Indian allies have won it for the Spanish? Yeah, probably, but it would have taken longer. Without the Indian allies, could the disease have done it all by itself? No, because there weren't enough Spaniards. They didn't have enough men there. Okay, so all 3 of these things, the steel weapons and armor, the Indian allies, the power of disease, and here are some modern smallpox sufferers in the 20th century. These things, when taken together, they were the primary factors in terms of giving the Spanish the necessary advantage they needed to beat the Aztecs and bring down the Aztec Empire. There were some lesser advantages, which I talked about. There were some non-advantages that need to be thrown out with the garbage. But ultimately, yeah, you get the picture. So, okay, guys, I hope that all makes sense. And, yeah, I'm done. I'll see you soon.